All right. Let us... I'll tell you more later.
Underwater.
Those days were astonishing. Actually, one of the students from the Muslim was listening to, but there was one series of occasions of protest that the situation was so desperate in the 1970s that a person that I met 2 days before that had circumcised himself without medicine.
Oh my God.
I mean, the issue of what it means, we're talking about integrity and trying to maintain a sense of freedom. And I mean, living in America, you have no idea what people do to maintain a sense of freedom and honesty and commitment. It's some of these things are so mind-boggling. We live in this kind of privileged world. People who struggle for freedom and against these things are something else. All right, so let me tell you what I want to do today. As I normally do, I want to begin by a series of reflections on a couple of topics that bring us into the chapters that we're dealing with. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion. I also have a poem by Rilke that I'll tell you how I want to kind of look at it. And then we'll look at 4 chapters that would be pertinent to the material. All right, so what I want to begin with is open up a couple of series of questions that have been on my mind and that are pertinent to what we're dealing with. Because I think you're reading all this other material, so you've got a lot of background material. You don't need me to summarize or discuss certain things and try to come at it from different angles. So, the book that we're looking at, the book of Job, is this work that is dealing with the pain of suffering of the individual. We've been thinking about the relationship between language and suffering. We've been thinking about the relationship between suffering and tradition. We've been thinking about the relationship between suffering and compassion and friendship. What would constitute consolation? And overall, to a certain degree, we're trying perhaps to think about the book of Job as, in the broadest sense, a composition that's a kind of spiritual exercise that is focusing on the transformation of consciousness from a certain kind of embedded piety through a series of dialogical or interrelational discussions on the issue of inherited versus personal wisdom, trying to lead to a final integration. Now, a couple of people raised the issue, also Sarah Jo in her prompt paper as well. We're trying to come in at the question of some of the writers were giving the presumption or the presupposition that the best way to read the book of Job is not from a historical or critical point of view, but from a larger literary and dialogical point of view. I think that in part that strategy is not to collapse the historical differences and the emergence of this from a primary folktale to a more complicated issue, but to try to see what kind of reading strategy would allow you to really learn from the book. In other words, if you're only focusing on certain complicated compositional questions, which in many cases are kind of presupposition, you may lose sight of the larger human issues that would instruct one. Part of the issue then would be, do you focus on the teachings of the various friends as a series of attempts to create something of the spectrum of traditional options, which Job is trying to push back against? And then you might say, what are the variations? How are they articulated? To what degree is this a complete or incomplete theology? To what degree do they reflect some type of Deuteronomic perspective, or some kind of Deuteronomic cum with wisdom perspective, say from the book of Proverbs, where the book of Proverbs does give you this larger sense of a divine majesty that's incomprehensible, some broad sense of karmic balance, things working out one way or another. If you do something, something happens overall because of what is often called a kind of constitutive justice. It's not retributive justice. The Deuteronomic notion is retributive justice, but a constitutive justice is things sort of balance themselves out overall. And that's part of the deep divine wisdom embedded in the universe from the point of view of, let's say, a book like Proverbs, in terms of its inherited Near Eastern wisdom. It's less concerned with what Deuteronomy would call retributive justice. You get what you deserve one way or another because the law is the will of God and something has been disrupted, so that has to be put into balance. A constitutive justice is, in a certain sense, a deeper structure in the universe, not simply related to the divine will. So I'm using the kind of co-term of a kind of karmic balance, and it works itself out one way or another, and the proper person should attune themselves, in a certain sense, to that deep truth in existence, as opposed to, say, being obedient to the divine will. To a certain degree, there is a kind of interconnection between those two perspectives. I'm not saying that it's done in a super deliberative way, but the authorship of Job has combined both speculative wisdom from the ancient Near East, as it's particularly reflected in the book of Proverbs, let us say, which is among the books of speculative wisdom that we have from the ancient Near East and in the Hebrew Bible, which would then include, of course, Ecclesiastes and Job as forms of speculative wisdom, and something that's related to Deuteronomy and retributive justice. So one certain difference that gets muddied in this process is that, to some degree, constitutive justice, which would mean you have to find the inner yin and yang within things, right? You have to kind of find that inner balance. And from that point of view, God doesn't eyeball you, he eyeballs the system, right? Because the system, in a certain sense, is a deep reflection in the natural order of something of that divine truth. So it would not be appropriate to say God's screwing me up because God's angry, or God can't control God's anger, or God is got the wrong proportion about justice because he's trying to kind of say, Fishbane, take a look at your actions. You're so filled with what you're doing that you need a little bit of suffering to kind of put the brakes on and turn around and say, what am I doing? So I repent, I do teshuvah, I do something like that. And I'm able to look at myself because that kind of gives me a speed bump, right? So part of this notion of divine suffering and learning from suffering is that I wouldn't be paying attention to the normal things. I'd be driving through all the red lights, and all of a sudden I get a flat tire and I almost hit a lamppost, and I have to say, look, I got to stop and see what's going on. Okay? So there's a kind of complicated fusion because one way or another within the framework of retributive justice, or let's say the justice of the book of Deuteronomy, is that there's some dimension of what we would call or you'd call in Christian language providence. It's the Jewish term is hashgacha, but whether it's general providence that God is concerned with the overall order of the species, or whether God is concerned with you and your tiny little life. Those are different ways in which the issue of divine providence would be understood, of course, with all kinds of subtle variations. And you can see that some of these issues are not sorted out altogether that completely. So, we began the course. Sarah, do you have any response to that? Because a number of people actually alluded to that, but is there anything, one of the things that you said, maybe it might trigger to other people, is that you said that one should not lose sight of the historical dimension, because that, the way I think you said it was, it helps you realize that this is a universal document that's dealing with all kinds of people at different kind of places, and seeing its unfolding in history just sort of keeps you grounded to some degree, and it's not just an abstract literary document. I'm trying to in some ways walk between that, but I just wondered whether you had any...
No, I mean, you articulated it way better than I even did in my paper. But yeah, I mean, I guess I appreciated just the little bit of background that you brought in, talking about Deuteronomy and that perspective. But I guess what I was trying to get at is that if we lose sight of that it was written, that there was a development of the text, and we lose sight of it was response to the world, that this was something that was written in response to types of things that were happening during that time. And I just didn't think that it was appropriate to lose complete sight of that. And I don't think either Newsome or Jansen do lose sight of that. And I think there are times that they continually refer to the historical context, even though at the beginning of their text they do kind of say they're trying to move away from that. So I guess that's what I was...
Okay, that's fair enough. So in some ways it would be to say, well, we may have inherited some form of Job the patient, the way you have in the Epistle of James, right? He doesn't say anything bad, and that's the Job of the folk tale that we even have in the apocryphal literature on the narrative of Job. And then we have all these dialogues which are Job the impatient, right? He doesn't suffering gladly. So anyway, bear a little bit of that in mind. I think it's important also to realize that a culture may inherit certain literary texts, and then certain life situations make those things very, very complicated. And then one of the interesting, from a literary theological point of view, is how that frame narrative is integrated into this anger narrative, perhaps, or the suffering narrative, and whether it's legitimate, and how to read the text in a kind of developmental way that one could go through the book as a series of transformations, okay? To some degree. Some of you may reject that notion, some may feel, and I'm going to, towards the end of the hour, I want to kind of even push back against the notion that the friends are only a negative pole in the Jobian argument, but they actually offer, as a number of people said in their prompt papers, statements that need to be taken seriously and can't be just thrown out. And so I want to come back to that. So I want to talk, before we look at the sources, I was trying to think of how can we continue the discourse based on the beginning discussions of the notion of the caesura, the crisis moment, where you fall back down out of the tradition, you fall to the ground, this rupture, and then we're trying to rebuild a life and rebuild a theological life out of the crisis that has integrity to the tradition, but integrity to one's feelings primarily. And to try to find that right balance between personal experience and something that's the inherited wisdom that's much larger than one lifetime, and even one lifetime of suffering. Okay? So that, it's a very complicated dialectic. I mean, not all of you have kids, but you all have been adolescents. And part of the issue is parents sort of want their kids to benefit from their wisdom and their experience, so you don't have to go through it, and so on and so forth. Or that they think that they have achieved something that's meritorious. And kids, all of us, need to kind of find out some things on our own, right? And the fact is that civilization couldn't exist without both. It couldn't exist without people really rebelling and saying, screw your inherited knowledge, I gotta find out something on my own. You know, when I was your age, we all read Jack Kerouac's On the Road. You gotta go on the road to discuss it. You just can't sit and hide. You have to go on the road to accumulate experiences. So there's this two things, that there is an inherited wisdom, and then without some form of revolution or rebellion, from the psychological or whatever level, civilization couldn't be renewed. It just couldn't be renewed. It would just become this really dead old fogey thing. As much as parents would like to have their kids become young fogies. You'll see when you have kids. But but that is so important to have that space of rebellion, transformation, needing to do it on your own. So I was trying to think about kind of three topics that are kind of moving us forward before we get next week to chapter 28. And I jotted down kind of three things which I want to kind of reflect on, that each of which have subcategories. I'll kind of talk them through. In the middle of the first one, we'll take a look at the Rilke poem. And then at the end, we'll come back and look at the sources. So the first question, the overall question is, what can you really know? What can you really know? Because we're dealing with a text, you have traditions, and you have pain. You have your own experience. What can you really know that you can build a life on? I think that's part of the deep issue that's going on in the book of Job. Right? What can I know my pain? The friends say, I know, I've seen it, I'm chalking up little bits of experience, etc. So, the first thing I think you can know, so this is point number one. And again, I want to just present them as three issues. I'm not hierarchizing them. I think that would be the wrong thing to do. So the first thing that you can really know is the truth of your own body. We can all know the truth of our own body. The truth of our body that's expressed in pain, sickness, in love, things that are so deep that they are pre-verbal to some degree, and you know that in your body. There is a wisdom and a learning that's incarnate, right? We're creatures of flesh and blood, and we know it at this very deep natural level. And no one can deny you your knowledge of your pain. No matter what anybody ever says. They may give you a different explanation for your pain, but they can't deny your own knowledge of your pain. And presumably also a friend, no matter what a friend would ever say, could never deny that, or that would really, that would be obtuse. There may be a reaction to the pain that a person sees, to the degree to which a person has empathy. But you can't deny a person, any of you who have ever been sick or experienced it, you can't deny the experience that you're going through. There's an interiority, there's a private feeling, right? There's an issue of my suffering, there's a big I involved. Not an ego I, but there's a real big I involved, right? And I want to stress that. And it's not only pain, but it's also love, it's friendship, it's caring, but things that are really tangible, really, really tangible on the inside. Now, one of the questions that we've begun to explore is what is the relationship between that first order experience and the second order experience of language. Even before language is an explanatory system, one would hope it's an expressive system. It's expressing the pain, to give it voice, to give it back, to put it back into the world, right? To give it some issue. Now the danger, obviously, is that second order language can dissociate you from your first order experience, right? And one can move too fast to the second order language of tradition before you have fully exhausted the first order language, not neurotically, but the reality of your pain. And you can obviously get screwed up through neurotic stuff, but let's assume, let's give it the best reading, okay? So in some cases, the saying is not a saying out of the pain, but a saying to soften the pain, right? In some cases, the saying is a saying to other the pain, to give it a certain kind of otherness to what I'm going through. So even in the best sense, to look at it, right? To feel it. What, I asked myself, would be the best form? Is there a place that language could have that is not just expressive language, not just second order explanatory language, but the language of the pain, right? Now obviously, perhaps it's painting that might do that best. I don't know if name Jackson Pollock is a name for, but or Duquesne, others, painters who, in an enormous amount of psychological pain, just threw paint on the canvas. In other words, it comes out of their inner being, and it is there's no difference between the stuff on the canvas and the stuff inside from there, if it's working, right? Because you're bypassing the gap. Now, it's obviously a lot harder in language. So I would say that if it works, it's the capacity of the poet to say the pain. Not to express the pain, but to say the pain. So that the self in pain that says the pain opens up into consciousness that deep otherness which is the mystery of the universe, which is not the constructed nature. In other words, if you leap from the pain to a constructed, you have the world in a certain kind of matrix or a skein of meaning. If the poet can say the pain, it would open up that larger dimension beyond the self, which is that world which is understood in terms of its fragility and its pain and its brokenness. Not as explanation, but the truth of that is now found in the depths of existence. Okay? So I thought the very opening lines of the Rilke. This is from Das Stundenbuch. It's not the whole poem, but it's just the opening part of the third book and the first chapter, which, to some degree, it's a decent translation, gives you some sense that we can keep in mind when we come back to Job, whether you can speak the pain that is the pain of the mysterious otherness of fragility and painfulness that opens you to that dimension of existence that needs to be said, and that puts the self in a larger than self context. It's not self-centered, it's putting oneself into that larger context. That there is pain and brokenness in the universe, and that speaking touches that. So it's not just a self-statement, right? It's an ontological statement. So I just want to read this and have some response, and I want to go on to some of the other things because we'll come back to these things. So this is the translation by Barrows and Macy, two women. I just say that because the two women who are translating the Rilke. It feels as though I make my way through massive rock like a vein of ore alone, encased. I am so deep inside it, I can't see the path or any distance. Everything is close, and everything closing in on me has turned to stone. Since I still don't know enough about pain, this terrible darkness makes me small. If it's you, though, press down hard on me. Break in, that I may know the weight of your hand, and you, the fullness of my cry. The you, of course, is God. So I'll give you a second just to think on that. I'm offering this as an example of de profundis, speaking from the depths, so that the voice de profundis that comes out of those deep places is speaking that pain that is somewhere deep in the ore of existence. Right? Right? And the poet doesn't want solace from God. Just wants a kind of nearness. Right? A nearness of presence. Something. It's not a saving God. It's not a consoling God. It's a near-ing God. Not just God who's near, but it's a nearing God. In a certain sense, the closest parallel to that sense is Psalm 73. Which comes to the ending that all the poet has is an intuition of ata imadi, you are nearby. There's a nearing, a nearness. And that's sufficient. Right? Right? It's not even a hand of warmth, it's a hand pressed on, right? Something of that. So if this is something close that came to my mind when I was thinking of it, it's something close to the saying of the pain, where the pain and the saying are somehow linked, right? And the voice of the poet is no longer the individual in pain, but voicing the pain of being, right? It's much larger. Because obviously one of the issues is whether the individual how much weight can you put on the voice and the pain of the individual, and where is its truth, and To what degree is that truth a kind of deeper truth of existence that either not everybody has experienced or can see? So it relates to a very key question that I'm not going to answer. I can't answer it, but I can at least pose it. What does suffering teach? Right? What does suffering teach? And I'm not asking it as a Jew or a Christian. Just what does suffering, the pain in the body, teach that other kinds of experiences and knowledge don't teach? What does it teach about your body, about the world, about the mystery? What does it teach? What can you learn from the suffering? Some degree, this learning from suffering is this opening to the deep sorrow of things. Right? We're not talking about traditional, it's a deep, it's what Lucretius called lacrimae rerum, right? The tears of things. Right? The world is suffused with tears. The lacrimae rerum, one of the great phrases. Right? To talk about the world as lacrimae rerum. So there's something that's opened up from that, right? There's something, perhaps. But so at this first stage, just asking you to think, what can you really learn? Not, I can become a better this or a better that. What can you really learn if you stay constant to your pain? That you couldn't learn from anything else. About how to be with yourself, be with another, be in the universe. It's a question, right? But there is a deep learning that's ontological, that's different than what the traditions are going to say, perhaps. But that's a question. So, when you speak from your pain, what have you learned, or you just blabbering? So that's the first issue. Let me go to these other three, and then we'll talk about all three, and then we'll go to the texts that I want to look at. So the first issue is the truth of one's body, and that the self in pain may be opened into some kind of otherness into which the self is a part, of which the self is a part. Whether it's just ontological, if it includes God, I'll leave that to you. Okay, I'm not going to deal with that. But it's beyond or before constructed senses, before I construct anything. I have a wisdom. You have a wisdom. So now the second, what else? And I'm trying to build myself on the book of Job. So the first thing, your child says, what can I know when I know pain as a person? Now, it's a book that's filled with other people, friends. So I was led to a second reflection. One could have many more, but I was led to a second reflection. Another thing that I can know, that I can really know, is I can know the presence of another person. I can know my own pain, and something else I really know because you're staring me in the face. You're right there next to me. You're an other body. I know that there is otherness besides me. I'm going to keep it in personal terms because we're dealing with this book. It's not like I bump into the tree and this and that. I know those kinds of things too. I have different orders in which I bump into the world, or I stand back from the world. But I know the limit because I can't press myself into you. You are. I can say I about me, but I can't say I about you. Just by saying you to you, you're not me. I can never say I about you, and you can never say I about me. It's a real, real limit, right? So one of the things I really know, right? Know is already becoming a metaphor. But one of the things I really know is I know another person, another presence, right? And I know the presence of an other, right? The not me. And I know that not solely in terms of the truth or content of the other person's speech. That I know that you're speaking to me about something that's not in my head, right? It's not like I know you because I know that you're giving a speech to me, but I know you because of the otherness of the other, the real otherness that you are, and that otherness which you are, and I'm now linking this up to that first level of reflection, opens me up to the true otherness of being, right? So if that first level of phenomenological life reflection has me begin with the one thing I know is the pain of my body, or my body in pain, or that my body is my body, right? It's not your body, and that my body suffers ultimately opens me up to the embodiment and the suffering and the pain that's somewhere deep in the side of things. Maybe not the whole thing. There can be lots of love, but it also opens me up to that truth. Because we're trying to reflect through the book of Job. There's not universal reflections. So if the second order of reflection is a reflection that I am not you and you are not me, and you are other than I am. I know that I'm other than you. And I know that your otherness ultimately opens up to the vast otherness of all things that are not me. Right? I'm opened up to a deeper reflection. So what am I opened up to then? Because if I'm opened up to the otherness of you, you may be right in my face. You may even be a person I love and we kiss each other. But there's still a gap. Right? But the thing that's opened up in this thing is the true gaps in existence. Gaps. Right? Now it may be a gap that could be filled, but you're opened up to gap. Right? It's not presence which is immediacy, but you're opened up to gap, absence, as a deep truth. That there's separateness that's part of unity, perhaps. So I would phrase it, if we're talking about these larger terms, you're opened up to the infinite chasm of difference. The infinite, that's what I would just... I hope a phrase works, but it's the infinite chasm of difference. Because I'm trying to keep the terror of the chasm of difference. Because that chasm of difference can really make me a moral person in relationship to you. The chasm of difference. Right? Of my deep respectfulness for the otherness of you and the stone and the tree. Deep moral ecology, right? Yeah, Elsa.
Can you draw the connection about how that makes you a moral person?
The link is that when I'm becoming aware of that vast otherness, I become aware of the fragility and my responsibility to all the things that I do in relationship to you and other things. To the degree to which I become a reflecting person at that moment, I have to do so with full ethical responsibility. Right? Every move that I make to cross that gap, if I do it with consciousness, is an ethical action. Notice it's not simply knee-jerk. It's not based on the tradition that's encoded in my body. All these things may be great things. I maybe need tradition to be encoded in my knee-jerk reactions, because otherwise I'd be a real jerk. So I need traditional knee-jerks. Because I could be a jerk, right? You can be a jerk. We're all jerks. But you sometimes need tradition to have a knee-jerk reaction. Sometimes you do the right thing just because you learned it, right? But to the degree to which you have some reflective consciousness, I think every move you then make has an ethical tenor to it. Because you're aware that it didn't have to be this way. I'm taking responsibility. My response is responsible in relationship to that. So it's not an ethical system, but it's deep ethics in the sense that I take responsibility. It becomes reflexive in the doing of it. And that reflexive is related to the otherness which you are, which makes me have to relate to you in a certain way. That is to say, there are limits to my power. That I can impose myself upon you. Or shout you down. Or talk so fast that you can't get a word in edgewise. It's power, right? Or from the other side, to try to be aware of the claim that you're making from where you are. I may think it's cuckoo, but I have responsibility, unless you're trying to kill me, I have responsibility to at least have some sense of what your claim is. I'd be a dope if I just let you kill me. Because they say that's your right to have a claim, right? But so there are certain limits. We don't want to talk about limit situations about other people's claims, but it's the simple claim. Let me get a word in edgewise, right? It's a very simple claim. I'm here, right? I'm that kind of a thing. Yeah.
So the chasm of difference maintains the distance, which forbids or precludes reifying and objectifying.
That too, yes. I think that's Adrian is saying that it forbids reifying, things like that. From my point of view, if I, just my response to your statement, if I were to put a much larger theological category over that, based on what you're saying about reification and so on, I would say that the primary commandment that emerges from this is, you shall have no other idols before my face. In other words, if there is a divine, that's this otherness of presence within difference, it's saying that no manifestations of this can be reified and turned into idols. Because once I do that, that's my projection onto the other. It's not what the other is from within their feeling painful reality. Okay? You're breathing and living and so on and so forth. And if I turn you to stone like Medusa with my gaze, right? It's not because I've done that as an immoral act. I've turned you to stone with my gaze. But it's not because you have any... It's not even because you are stone. I made you stone in my consciousness. Right? So that's part of the commandment against idolatry, which is a deep ground of that. But it doesn't mean that deep ground of idolatry is an ethical thing, right? In the first instance, it's just you can't fix things in the improper way. Right? There is an ethical component that emerges from this ultimate commandment of that. So this attestation that I have of your otherness leads out into infinity. It leads out into infinity. The same way that my experience of my bodily pain can lead out into infinity of something of the sorrow and tears of existence, which doesn't mean that there aren't good things in existence, but that there's something that my pain has opened me up to in deep awareness. That it's something I really know. And then I can also really know that chasm of difference that leads out into infinity. The fragility of meaning making, right? Which we're talking about a little, that's related to ethics. So then a question arises, since we're talking about friends and friendship and discourse between friends and friendship. Can the other perceive the otherness of the other? Can the other, because I'm also an other, can I perceive your real otherness? Or is this too fearsome? I can't allow myself to do that. So I close it over, or I give it an explanation. You represent something that's too frightening to see, perhaps. Or, what's the flip side? In friendship. And again, we're not talking about Aristotelian friendship, which is agonistic. I'm talking about the kind of friendship, can one help can one help the other see the total otherness of being? In other words, you help them in their pain not to give an explanation, but that you can help them see the otherness with this big O, right? That they are opened up into that. They see things in this real big depth, right? Because that's one of the things, perhaps, it's not consolation in any simple way. Or maybe it's consolation in the old sense of atheist. It's consolation in the deepest sense, that you make a person aware of the sorrows of things in the great otherness. It's a deep consolation. It's not a consolation as a specific explanation. It's that task of philosophical friendship that consoles by helping the person understand their place in being, perhaps. So there's one aspect of friendship that you help, perhaps because you have the pain and perhaps you see the otherness of the other, you can help the other not have a new explanation based on tradition, but you can help the other find some truth in that full otherness of things, which is not an explanation, it's a new feeling state that I think precedes these explanations. So then I jotted down here that this, and here it's related to the Jobin reflections, it doesn't bypass language, it doesn't have to bypass language, and it doesn't have to dispense with language, but it rides the wave of language into those depths. Riding the wave of language will also mean to understand the limits of what language can say. Right? And that, I think, is part of this wisdom of the book of Job that we'll come to in chapter 28. Not that these things are wrong, we don't have their place, but there's a consciousness also of limit. And that's part of this deep humility of the other. Words do work, but you have to also be simultaneously aware of their limit. It's a double consciousness. Otherwise, the words become the idols of tradition, perhaps. And it's a real challenge whether you can hold both in mind simultaneously. Yeah, listen, before we get to the third one, let's
I'm having a little bit of trouble imagining how language can work. So I guess a question that I've been asking myself these past few weeks is, we're building theology from the place of the abyss, the crisis moment, the primal experience where language breaks down, where tradition reveals itself to be inadequate. And I'm trying to understand how one can pivot out of that to do theological building without immediately falling into tradition. So, in regards to what you've just said, I'm having trouble imagining what it looks like to use language to help the other find the truth in the otherness of things, and what it looks like to ride the wave of language into those depths without the language somehow collapsing into tradition. I guess what I'm saying is, at this exact moment in time, the best that I can imagine one can do is redeploy tradition in some kind of ironic or parodic way, which is how Newsome reads the later passages in Job in the chapter that we read for today. I am super interested in whether there's another possibility and want to have some clarity on what that would look like, if you can sort of help us move there.
I do want to help you move there, but I want to wait a little bit later in the chapters. So you're absolutely right, this ironic and parodic use, where it's strong, but you're aware of its weakness.
Is there something more constructive that we can do with language that is, what does theological novelty look like here? How can we use language in a way that is sensitive to its limits without sort of just accidentally falling into the old patterns of tradition?
I think that, I think the question is a real question. So I think the first middle step will be next week when we do chapter 28. And then we'll have to wait till the final speeches of God. But I think trying to understand the book as a process, which includes the process of the capacities of speech, is to really exhaust its powerful possibilities for tradition and the friends, or the ironic or subversive uses that I mentioned last time, and I'll come back to that text. You have to really stay with that for a while. You have to stay with that for a while so that you take it to that it becomes a real experiential limit. Not a cognitive limit, but it's an experiential limit. Now, obviously, the inescapable is that you always have to speak in the language that you've inherited, right? So it's the old paradox, you can never jump out of your shadow. You always are casting the shadow of your body and what you've learned, right? So you can, no matter how high you jump, you can never jump out of your shadow. So, but that said, there may be other possibilities, and I think one of the other things to be thinking about as well, which is a situation that maybe Job couldn't think about, and we can in the 20th century, is that we also inherit the language of many other traditions.
Oh, that was another possibility that I'd thought of. There's this really wonderful line in the chapter we read from Newsome about every context having an overlap of multiple languages, basically. So in addition to irony and parody, you can borrow from other traditions and write them into your own.
Yeah. So I think that's some of the things that we need to kind of think about, even for all of us, particularly in a place like this, where you're encouraged to do that as part of becoming a person, it's a certain new way of the new humanism. That's like when I think there's an essay, I guess it was like 1960 or 61, when Eliade, they first started the History of Religion journal. And he speculated on a new humanism. And that's precisely what it is, that you become human in this more, in a different, thick way. It's not the old humanism, it's a different, and it will involve many other different kinds of things. I think one of the things that I want to come back to that's raised by your question, and I have personal proclivities, but I'm not always sure how it works. The simple answer, but hopefully we'll come back to this in a deeper way, is to have some kind of integrity. You can't speak multiple languages or multiple theological things. You have to somehow bring it all back into one language that really works for you. Now, that language, whether it's some form of Judaism or Christianity or Buddhism or whatever it might be, may have broken down. But there is a deep encoding of some of that structure in the depth of your being. And you want to try to see whether you can bring something from the outside into those fillers, into those spaces of the inside. Otherwise, you're disingenuous. I mean, you cut yourself off from your own roots. So there's something complicated about this, and I want to come back to that. And I think that's one of the hard tasks after you've kind of burned through some of this language and purified it, and it's gone through this smelting process, so that everything, because remember we looked at the first class, so that you're not just talking similes and metaphors, you're speaking out of the truth. But that once you can then begin to speak out of that truth where there's no gap between, you're trying to make it work. Because when we're trying to retrieve parts of our lost tradition, we're trying to make it work by private translations and explanations. We're trying to get to a place where you can begin again without losing your deep ground of how you grew up and what works, and then somehow find a new language that fits into those deep spaces, those deep primal symbols that you first experienced as a kid, touched, things that never go away, right? So I want to try to come back to that. I don't think it's simple. It obviously is very hard to do, and most traditional people are very frightened of that. It's not, but it's not a relativism. I'm trying to find a new foundation. And part of that foundation has to arise from the structures of the body that has experienced all these things and has grown up in a certain kind of template with deep experiences of symbols. And you become this new person by being able to make that language work now within this old primal grammar. We're pretty far from that now, and most of you can see just by the kinds of modern fundamentalism how frightening that is, so you flip to the other side. For all kinds of reasons you flip to the other side. It is a hard task, and maybe it's not for everybody, but at least we can try to talk a little bit about it. So I don't think that there's any simple. So let's stay with that. Let's stay with that. But I'm glad that you say that. But let's stay with it. I'm not ready yet to say more. So now let's talk about the third thing. So the first thing is the truth of my body. Second thing is the truth of you. And then, you may be surprised by this because I want to retrieve it. Another thing that I know is the wisdom of the tradition that I've inherited. That would be really stupid for me to cut off a branch that's taken so long to grow that I'm sitting on. Right? Here I'm sitting on it, and like Bernstein Bears, right? So, the accumulated wisdom of others. Because the accumulated tradition is the accumulated wisdom of others who are not me. I acknowledge that other people have found the wisdom. And it's accumulated over the generations. And it preceded me. It preceded me. Thank God. I don't have to begin again. But I don't know yet what I'm going to do with it. Right? That's a great thing. That cultures accumulate their wisdom. Of course, they can turn it into an armored suit. But it's a great thing. And I can know, in other words, it's one of those things that are a priori. Because I get it when I'm growing up at home. If my parents or the religious instructions giving it to me, they're not saying that they're making it up as they're going along, or they're not saying that it's historically, it's like there. It's something that's a gift of the past. So one of the things I can know is it may not be right for me, but I can know that I have a gift from the past. Right? I can know that, because it's objective. I just go into the library. God Almighty, that's the gift from the past. So where do I go? In the shelves. Right? That's only arranged by the Dewey Decimal System. It's not arranged by some hierarchy of some religious knowledge. Right? So when I go into that cavern, I'm going into the gift of the past. So what shelf do I stop at? What do I have to keep going on to? And create this kind of vast web. You ever read Borges' The Library of Babel? You got to read it again then. So this is something I do really know. I know I have this wisdom. But then there are boundary points. One of the boundary points of tradition is that it can make a person arrogant. I really know, I think I know more than I know. So the question then becomes, at what point does tradition become rhetoric and what Nemo called technique? So anybody want to talk to that point? I think he makes some very interesting points about technique, using it from a psychoanalytic point of view, but I think it's a much broader, a techne. Anybody want to respond? At what point, in other words, tradition is a gift, but then tradition can become a rhetoric. And that's when it's not real, it's just a rhetoric. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Right? Or it is a technique, which for Nemo means what? You remember what he said about what a technique is? Anybody? So everybody's read it and they're just hesitant to tell me. What does he mean by, what does technique do in the positive sense? What is technique as a problem? What do you think it might mean? All right, so I'll let you do it at home and go back to it. But one thing of technique is that it gives you some resource to get things done. It gives you a resource, a language resource, term resource, style of argumentation, right? But another thing that technique can do is it gives you the illusion that you've got your finger on it. You've got it under control, right? That the technique has outlasted what it's talking about. So the question that has to be raised from the point of view of the book of Job is, at what point does pain or suffering trump tradition? Right? That the knowledge of the personal suffering just has to abide even within the larger framework of tradition. It can't say the whole thing. And that may not deflate all of tradition, but it certainly puts it into a certain kind of suggestive balance. It limits it in a humble way. It doesn't, right? It's not an absolute tradition. It becomes a tradition that's also trying to do something and helping. But when the tradition, like with the friends, try to stifle pain, it's not doing something right. So there's this interesting balance, which we'll look at when we take a look at some sources in a second, of this relationship, not wanting to stifle pain and not wanting to stifle tradition. Okay? To let each have its truth within that. And the greatness of Job as a person is he will not let the pain of his individual experience be stifled. And he represents that in a monumental way. That's one of the greatest. He represents that in a monumental way. I won't let my pain be stifled. And you can talk. That's why he said, I know what you're saying. I've experienced it too. You're not telling me. But he won't let that be factored out by just talking about mysteries. Right? We'll come back to these texts in a second. But it may be true that God is an unknowable mystery. Right? But that doesn't mean that pain is not real. And saying that God is a mystery, you should just humble yourself into that mystery, doesn't fully answer the question that I am led to a deep, deep confusion because of the life I've led and the suffering that I have. And telling me that everything is a mystery is not the complete, full answer to things. Right? It works at one level, but it doesn't cut it completely. So Job represents this monumental human dignity. A monumental human dignity. Over against this claim of this monumental majesty and mystery of God. Because all of them are aware of the monumental majesty of God. And even if they all were to acknowledge that God is aware of the suffering, etc., there's still something monumental about the claim that Job is making. I need to know in my life where it fits into this mystery. Right? Just the big language of the big M won't do it. Right? Because I'm living a painful piece of that mystery. I'm living a painful piece of the mystery. And I need some sense. I can't collapse it and say, okay, I'll give up all of that, and say it's part of the mystery of existence. Right? So So you can already see there's a very, very powerful tension here that's articulated by these traditions, but it has to. So part of the issue that also Job will raise is this issue whether tradition trumps pain or pain trumps tradition, or what are their balances? And is Job going too far when he seems to feel that his pain in relationship to the life he had been living is the violence of God? And I just want to put that big phrase, it's not a blasphemous phrase, it's a big phrase on the table. Because we have a very strange book. And it's even set from the very framework, right? For all kinds of ego reasons, God does violence without cause. That's how the book is set up. It's opening this up in a very strange way. Right? God is incited by one of his little minions that he's got the best guy who's worshiping him, and he does violence to his family, his body, just for what? Right? And then the other aspect of divine violence, you can give it a very nice name. You talk of divine punishment, retribution, or punishing to make you a better person, to repent, to learn from your suffering. So that's just a nice way of talking about divine violence. Right? Right? Judges sit in big robes and they issue judgments of punishment. Right? But you can't conceal the fancy form of it from the violence that's done to another person. Right? So let's not forget that there's a scale here that you maybe feel more or less comfortable with one of those ways of talking. You may feel, Fishbane's bordering on the blasphemous. But there's a scale between punishment, retribution, divine anger, a little bit over the top, way over the top, uncontrolled. Right? And they're all talking within that spectrum. But this is a God who does harm to human beings. Right? So the God who does harm, which is part of this deep concern, is it harm so that I'll become a better person? Tough love? God is tough love. Okay, so you swallow that and figure it out. But that's where we're at, right? We're talking about a God who harms. None of them are denying this. The question is, what's behind all of this? What's behind it? Is God's power in any way related to anything we know about limited moral justice? And even if it is, would that make it more palatable? So, we have to figure out what is the right kind of moral and humble response within this huge business. And then the ultimate paradox, and now we'll turn to the text. The ultimate paradox is that we don't have a clue. Don't have a clue. All this Jabberwocky is going on from chapter 3 on, and we don't have a clue of what took place in heaven. Don't have a clue. And that's what the author is, you don't have a clue. Right? And he raises you don't have a clue to this ultimate irony of this weird God that you would never even imagine from any of the books of the Bible, who's engaged in this kind of bet. But it serves this deep theological function, doesn't it? Saying, you have no clue of what's really going on. You're just talking under the dome of heaven. Just talking based on your accumulated traditions and wisdom. So, now as you come back to this, we have to say, what can you really say under the sealed dome of heaven? What kind of a theology can you construct if you can never crack that dome? Okay. But you have experience. And there may not be any relationship between that experience and all of that. Because this is not a book that is telling us, he's not quoting chapter and verse of Deuteronomy, God revealed his will, and you're not doing this, and this is the punishment, and we can now measure it. It's not in that framework. It makes it even much more complicated. So let's have 5 minutes or so of discussion about some of these things, and I want to look the last 45 minutes or so at 4 texts. Any further responses to what we've been talking about? Anything bubbling up? Yeah, Elsa. Okay.
Go ahead, Mary.
Okay, please.
Okay, I don't know if it's early to ask this question, but you did mention about a complicated fusion that exists in the book of Job. And then you came along and talked about the fact that there's a deep encoded structure in all that we are and all that we go through, upon which a new language is built upon. Is that something that is in Job? That is that complicated fusion? Is it resolved, or is it something that stays like that stays complicated, even at the end of the book? But is there?
Well, I'm hoping to try to suggest that there's something that does happen.
Okay.
Let's just see whether I'll try to present it as strongly as I can, and we'll see whether it works.
Okay.
Hopefully, I'm trying to stay with the book and its language, right? So it's not like the ultimate theology. It's trying to theology is working for Job, right? But I think it opens up something very precious. Because I think that the authorship is really profound authorship. Very profound. Can you imagine? I mean, these discourses, boy, they're struggling with this real, and they're not letting you off the hook, right? They're trying to give you, so I'm not going to say everything that I want to say in a couple of weeks, but but I think part of the issue is to stay with this and to feel these problems as strongly as possible. I think that's what the process of the reading is, trying to endure this back and forth, to endure it, to sit with someone and to keep talking back and forth until it just collapses. Not because those arguments don't make sense, they just collapse. Let's say Elsa was first.
This is going back to your second point, but when you were talking about helping the other to see the otherness, I guess I'm wondering if we could have multiple senses of what otherness means. And so am I and the other referring to the same otherness?
That's great. No, I don't know what I can say to that. Like, keep going on.
I mean, it just seems like that would add another dimension to to what we can really know, right? Because you were talking about we can really know something through that.
Right. I think I think you're speaking to a very great wisdom that's part of this. It's not like there's one otherness. There are lots of constructions of the otherness, and somehow realizing all of that is part of this wisdom, right? That even these large constructions are opened up to this really mega issue. Yes, I think you're right. If I imply that there, when you talk, goes through this chasm to the otherness, but talking with other people and living through these moments, you're opened up to all kinds of incredible things, and that's part of it because these are all just vectors that each human being is opening up. And it's not as if the fusion of all the vectors gets you at the truth, right? It's just the multiple vectors is itself a wisdom. It's not a sayable wisdom, right? It's a perception that you have, right? You can't talk to that otherness because it's also ineffable, but it's a multiple series of ineffable vectors. So I think I share what you're saying. I think I had that in mind, but I didn't say it that way. So, anybody else? Yeah.
I don't see a fusion occurring between the friends and Job. They seem, in the process that we've gotten so far, to be getting further entrenched in their different positions and not learning from each other. I'd like you to comment on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's ever a fusion. I think that they're talking, and part of the power of the multiple discourses is, in a certain sense, to feel the fact that each one of these spoken forms becomes a kind of self-enclosing bubble. A person's kind of spinning this bubble out of their speech. So they're speaking it, but yet there's a gap, and the other person is on the other side of that bubble of language, right? So it's trying to persuade, but I'm not sure it ever gets there. So I think that's part of what we're asked to endure as we read through it.
I was thinking of a Ricoeur approach to this, that the intensity is not meant for each other, but meant for us, the reader.
Yeah, also that. Yeah, definitely it's for us, the reader. But through the lens of their speech. Anybody else want to? Yes, please.
We were talking a lot about divine violence or divine punishment, and it's kind of going back and forth. But I wonder if there, is there a third option? Is God just curious? Does that count?
You know something?
What?
Want to share?
Well, just,
the curious God. Okay,
The
like,
sense
what would that mean in relation to what you're doing?
I don't know.
Is that what chapter 1 is about? The curious God?
Right. I think I don't. When I read it, it does not seem to me as though God is particularly angry with the Satan, or that he really wants to prove something. He's just kind of like, huh.
Go for it. Go for it.
And
Slam him. Go for it.
My thought is that does that really change the violence of it? Like, does that alter?
You tell me. What do you think?
I don't know. It's a question that I'm throwing out there. But
isn't the inherent carelessness and the curiousness kind of violent?
I don't know. I mean, to be
If I gave you
about
permission
something,
to kill all the cats, throw them against the wall, splatter them, just to see how they splatter. So, I'm just curious.
right. But I think it's certainly not the kind of curiosity that would make us comfortable.
Curiosity killed the cat.
Yeah, there you go.
Exactly. The curiosity killed the cat. But it is a word that I haven't.
All right, okay. Well, it's you're trying to diffuse it a little bit. Get a little bit of divine distance.
Potentially.
Good for you. I don't know. Anybody else? Yeah.
I think at that point, one thing I'm seeing is that there's a direct connection between suffering and speculation.
Suffering and speculation.
Yeah, that suffering becomes the stage to speculate, and then speculation becomes the stage for disclosure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's. It doesn't have to. Right? Speculation becomes a second or third order move.
Or
I'm trying to
Okay.
do stuff before that's speculative. Doesn't mean that it's wrong, that it may be, but I'm trying to talk about something before that. So let us look at 4 texts. Given the time that we have, we'll maybe each in about 10 minutes or so, but just the kind of, I've chosen them from this material just because I think that they articulate 4 different modes within this framework of biblical hermeneutics of the suffering. The first will be with Job, the second 2 will be the friends, and the fourth will be Job. So let's, I want to just highlight a series of words and phrases. So let's begin, we talked a little bit about chapter 7 last time, but open up to chapter 7 with your translation, and I want to highlight some features, and I'll tell you why I chose each of them, which I'm just using in a certain kind of paradigmatic way. So, why did I choose the first one? Because this first one, chapter 7, I think tries to do the work of knowing your pain, what happens when you feel your pain. When you let that pain get inside your body. And what do you then know about that world that we saw that Rilke was talking about? I think to some degree, chapter 7 is trying to do that work within the framework of biblical hermeneutics. The work of letting that pain come out as a pain that's not just my pain, but something that I come to know through my pain about the depths of things. So, what are the things that he mentions? And I just want to highlight, you have your translation in front of you, so I just want to begin to highlight some of the terms that are focused here. So he begins, I think where he comes to is to talk about radical mortality. Just the radical futility and mortality of what it means to be a person is something that Job comes to know from his pain. And look at the language that he says. He says, human life on the earth is a service, a burden, it's a labor, it's a war, it's a tzava, that's the term he uses. It's a kind of crisis. A person is on the earth like a hired day laborer. This sense, like a slave. he talks about like a slave who gulps for shadows. Gulps for shadows. I don't know how the translations are. Pants for a little shade. So I'm deepening it. Not just panting for shade, but gulping for shadows. You're in this heat of this torment, and you're gulping to find just some momentary place of shade. Right? To find some hope. And then he goes on, he talks about yarche shav, kind of false or meaningful or kind of inconsequential moons and nights that are filled with amal, labor. Those life as this daily torment, day after day after day, to find food, to find shade, day after day. That something he's becoming aware out of that pain. That life is this painful fragility, right? When I lie down in verse 4, I go to sleep, I say, when do I have to wake up? Everything is measured up. It's this ultimate futility of things. My flesh is filled with worms. Right? My body stinks. Life is faster than the shuttle on a weaver's loom. It ends without hope. This is that first level of knowledge that he's speaking the truth out of himself. Right? Remember that my life is like wind. Right? People look at me and then I'm gone. It passes like a cloud. Right? So I have to speak that. I speak that out of the bitterness of my mouth. Verse 11. I'm speaking that truth. I can't ignore saying it because it's, right? And then he used all this ironic language. Am I like the Tannin in the sea, etc., etc. So I hate my life. It's wearisome. And why do you pay attention and focus on the person from morning to night? In other words, he experiences divine providence not as some guiding thing, but just God's eye just won't let up. Right? It's this kind of focusing on the pain, morning, noon, and night. That's the way he's like turned this issue of providence into this kind of attentiveness that results in this life. So that's why he said, if I sinned, what am I doing to you? Why have you made me your enemy? And then he ends, would that I died into the ground, this desire for nullification. And people would look for me, and I'm not. But it's a pun, because he says, and people would seek me at dawn. It's a kind of look for me, but seek me at dawn. Right? So this first level, which comes back to that first kind of knowledge of the body, is the knowledge of pain. That life is just broken up into painful fragments. No respite. No respite. The body is decaying. Right? And the desire to disappear. Right? The desire to disappear. Not to be seen, not to be there. Right? It's a big thing. So this is that first voice. But he's not speaking just Job, talking Job talk. He's Job trying to speak through that pain of his body that he says something about existence, of what it means to be a human being. He can't ignore it now. Something in that pain. So you can't simply say that there's a disjunction between the life that he lived and now what he's talking about. But somehow that pain has opened him up to something about life, which is not just the cycle of the rituals, but it's the real deep cycle of sleeping in pain, waking up looking for food, trying to stay warm, wishing it was over, finding a place of shade. That's, you can't put anything in the ice chest. There's no ice chest. So each day is a whole different event. There's no socialized medicine. You can't go to the clinic. So your body becomes worms. Right? He's getting at something before all these institutions, right? You can't, the milk doesn't last to the next day. You gotta milk it, right? Each day is a hard day under the sun. You can't get oranges from Brazil when there's a frost in Chicago. So you go hungry. You can't take the baby that's born to neonatal care. Right? So this is, we forget that, but he's telling you where it's at. Where it's at when you're really at the subsistence level. He knows that now from pain. Don't forget that, he says. So that's Job. That's the first talk. That's that first thing we're talking about. Something that he now knows that we know it's true. It's covered over in lots of ways, but it's really a deep truth. So that's chapter 7, the knowledge that comes out of the body in pain. So now jump to chapter 11. And we're going to talk about one of the friends, Mr. Zophar. And I want to take Zophar on his own terms. We're not simply as a guy that you need to slam because he's one of the friends. He has something to say. What is he going to say? So he begins in chapter 11. I'm just going to give you the shame. If you have your other translation, since most of you don't have that, I'll read this. Should a speech go unanswered just because it is long? Someone with ready lips always right. You want to silence people with your bluster. Cow them with sarcasm. No one restrains you. You say, my teaching is perfect, that was pious, but it's in your eyes. So what is the thing that Mr. Zophar is getting at? He's aware of his desire to fill the void with speech. That's what he's saying to him. But we're trying to get, what is the truth that he's saying? Of this desire to fill the void with a lot of fast talk. It's fast, so that no one can counter the argument. Fast talk, right? And then he goes on in verse 7. He says, you're just talking a mile a minute. You're talking a mile a minute. Slow it down. And then he says in verse 7, do you have any privileged knowledge? Fake it aloha. Do you? Can you dope out God's ways? Do you really, you got some secret cosmic app that you're plugged in? Right? The God app? Hello, I'm hearing you. Right? Do you know something that we don't know? Are you, we're all here in this collecting spiritual evidence. Right? So are you, so you're talking so fast. Right? He's saying something that's very real and that's very true. Right? In verse 8, look at the vastness of heaven. Did you make it? look at how deep hell is. Do you have any sense of how deep it is? Right? Do you have any sense of that height or that depth? Right? Did you make it? Do you know it? Can your mind get around it? Right? It's just a word for you, but can your mind get around it? That's what he's saying. Right? It comes and it goes. Look at the length. Look at the size of the earth. Goes and it goes around the other side. You can't even see the other side. You blabber. What is the horizon, he's saying in verse 9. Look at the limited horizon you have, and you're making big claims. Right? Then in verse 11, so he says, right? Can you find out God's depths, the outer limits of Shaddai? What can you do at the heaven's height? Can you know that? What can you know that is deeper than Sheol, greater than the earth's extension, wider than the sea? And then he goes on to say that God knows this. He has some sense that there's something that exceeds human knowledge. He's using, there's something there that you're aware that exceeds human knowledge. And it knows that your knowledge is false. Hollow core man thinks he has some wisdom. Man born no better than a saddle ass or onager. The dumbass. That's what he's saying. If you stretch your mind or stretch out your hands, get rid of anything. So what he's saying something. Now he's saying something that's intriguing, right? He's talking, when he says that your mind can't get there, he's saying, come to terms with your mortal mind. Right? Come to terms with your mortal mind. And turn inward in humility, he says. And then there is some hope, he says. He uses that term. Then there's some hope. So what he says to Job, so if you turn and you stretch out your hands to God, then somehow you'll live with some kind of hope. Dig your burrow, lie secure, etc. So in our terms, what is he saying? So come to terms with the limits of your mind. Know that there's something much vaster. And open your hands to it. Thus he's saying, empty yourself into this vastness. We're trying to say, what can Zohar teach us? Empty yourself into this vastness. You need to empty yourself. Right? And part of that emptying is emptying the pretensions of your mind. Right? He's not saying anything about providence and punishment. He's saying, just look around you and not just make comments about, did I get screwed? But just empty your mind. And open your arms to it as a new wisdom. So silently, there's something that he's saying to us. But what doesn't he say? He's not addressing Job's body and pain. So it's not like anything he says is false. Right? He says to fall into humility. Open yourself to this vastness. Stretch your arms to it. Let it flood you. And people will respect you. They'll come to you because you'll manifest some kind of a new spiritual wisdom. They'll see in you that you're letting all of that work itself through you. And you have let your inquiring mind go, right? That mind that is investigating things. You're letting it go. And people will say, hey, there's a person who's achieved a level of spiritual wisdom. So it's not like what he's saying is not a very helpful piece of advice. He comes from the East. He's giving us a little Buddhist wisdom. He comes from the East. So he's schlepping a little wisdom from the East. And the one thing he's not talking about is the pain that Job has. Right? And so that pain doesn't go away with this big perspective. It doesn't go away. Maybe some people would say, some forms of Buddhist thought, yeah, but he's saying, Job doesn't say it won't go away. So this is Job talking, it's not Gautama Buddha, right? This is Job saying, my pain doesn't go away if I divest myself of the pretensions of knowledge. Okay? And what does that mean to me? What am I going to do with that? So number 3, Mr. Eliphaz makes a second appearance in chapter 15. And he begins in ways that echo his friend Sophar. So, he says, can a wise person answer? Your belly is filled with wind. Can anybody say anything? And then in verse 4, he says, all this bluster undermines spiritual reverence. So he's now putting it in the terms that so far, but slightly in terms of his own language. This notion of reverence, yira, awe of the majesty. Certain amount of talk undermines this perspective of divine majesty. There's a limit to talk, he's saying. He's saying that there's a limit. Verse 5. Let me just get this translation here. Guilt is what has schooled your mouth, and so you choose devious language. Your own mouth proclaims your guilt. So what might he be saying in our terms? He's saying, in our language, your need for self-justification has turned your mind into a series of arguments that justify you beyond what is reverent. You're trying so hard to explain and justify what's going on with you and your pain. That endless arguments has turned your life into an avon, a perversity, a sin, a form of self-justification. Or in our terms, he's got a false consciousness. The false consciousness is that he's shifted his mind away from the larger sense of reverence to an attempt to kind of keep explaining it from his point of view. And that has turned him into a sinner, in some sense. It's that meeting point between what the tradition calls sin, but it's this perversity of knowledge which is self-justification. Right? That's what his argument is to him. You've become an embodiment of a distorted mind. Right? You're just going too far. So then, let me just finish the question. So that perverting of the mind, and then he says, in verses 10 and verse 18, so he says to turn to tradition. Have the humility to let it go and to find some consolation in tradition. That's these tanchumot. There's something that he's perhaps saying, because the phrase, the tanchumot el, it's very hard. What verse is it? But what he means here, it's very hard to understand what that Hebrew is, because it's not clear whether this turning to tradition becomes a divine consolation, or it is the consolation that's accumulated through human beings through God. So now he's giving us a different option. In this unknowableness, there's something of a healing point of tradition. It provides some consolatory structure within this fragile, unknowable state. Right? It's the tanchumot. It's the consolation that God provides through the interpretations that human beings give of existence. But it doesn't mean that it's the ultimate truth, but it's a consolation. It's a deep consolation of how to just get your life back into a livable rhythm. So there's something that tradition somehow, in verses 25 and following, tradition somehow lessens the infinite unknowability. And it weaves something that, if taken too far, becomes a hubristic pretension. But it nevertheless weaves something of a truth, of an attempt to find some point of balance that you couldn't just do on your own. Right? Something. So there's a saving that God gives through the gift of tradition. That's the concept. Yeah, Mary.
So does this relate to then Nemo's technique? Would you see that this weaving is something that can quickly become? You just said it was related to hubris.
I think it goes both. Yeah, I think that there's a point when that weaving becomes its own idol, and then it becomes a negative technique. And I think he's hinting that there's one of the things that's bigger than you is the wisdom of the ages, and to kind of re-enter that. Just re-enter that. But not to re-enter that as if that's the whole truth. You still have all these, your own personal, right? But there's something of these accumulated gestures of the generations that helps you back into the world. That does give some kind of a dignity and sanctity. The question, not necessarily for Eliphaz, but the question is whether that can be true alongside the private name. Can you hold both together? There's something that is can take you beyond rebellion, right? The consciousness of rebellion, of self-deception, is something to accept a larger wisdom. So that's his perspective in 30 and following. So he's telling him to realize the limits. Realize the limits. That simply from the perspective of one mortal life, and part of the language he uses at the end of chapter 15 is like that language that Job himself used. The perspective of one life is really filled with futility. So one consolation is to raise that into the life of tradition, which may not answer the problem of suffering, but it raises up the fragility of the moments into something spiritually endurable. Right? When it tries to give all the explanations, it may collapse. But you see his language, he's talking about all that horror and perversity of the one life of a person. So there is some kind of uplift that tradition provides when it raises the broken life into a kind of higher spiritual gesture. Right? It becomes the technique when it tries to answer all the questions. But in the context of the way I'm trying to interpret this chapter 15, he's partly saying that, yes, life is, you're filled with wormwood, and your life becomes wormwood. There's no other way around it. But there's something that can raise that life into something a little bit higher. And that's something that is the tradition that he's saying. So this is not just emptying yourself into the depths of the mystery, but kind of reassemble your fragments into the rhythms of a larger wisdom. It's a different perspective. And then we have the final statement of Job, at least in this cycle, which I chose in chapter 16. And so he says, I've heard all the stuff that you're saying. So there's a different argument, right? I've heard everything you're saying. I know it just as well as you do. I know all this stuff. And when will you shut your mouth? With all your blabble. Because I'm like you and I have a right to speech. Just shut up for a minute and I will put together a few words, he says at the end of 4. And then he goes on and he says something else, which relates us back to what we began the class with. He says, if I speak, there's no end to my pain. It'll just flood you over. It'll make you weary. So he's saying, if I speak, my pain does not let up. If I stop, it doesn't leave me. It has worn me out. You have wiped out all my company, crumpled me, my witnesses. What kind of friends are you? So he's making, if you go through chapter 16, you see already in verse 6 to 8, my pain is me. And it has wrinkled me. On my body is the witness of who I am. So what he says to the friends ultimately is, I know these kinds of arguments. But what I also know is that you're not friends because you don't witness the pain that's before these arguments. Right? The failure of friendship, he's saying then, is the inability to see the depths of the other's pain. That's the failure of friendship. And to begin to talk, even if some of that talk makes a lot of sense in one level. He is his pain. The power of his pain. What he's saying in verses 6 to 8. The power of the pain is me. And then he experiences this as a divine violence in verse 11 and following. That's how he experiences it. And there's no two ways around it. Right? That's how he experiences it. Ale hands me over to evil man, tosses me into the wicked man's clutches. I was at peace when he shattered me, grabbed me by the neck, crumbled me, set me up as a target for shooting. His arrow men surrounded me, split my gut, spilled my life juices on the ground, breaks through me. O earth, don't conceal my blood. May my cry not find a place to rest. Even now my witness is in heaven, my corroboration on high. All the talk doesn't wipe away that pain. So in the end he comes back to the pain of my body has to be seen. Right? Friendship somehow is this relationship between my pain and this realization of my pain. That's what I'm speaking to. I'm not speaking to the argument, I'm speaking to the pain. Right? And the friendship has, and then he concludes with one final issue, which is the way I want to conclude. In verses 20 and following, it says, such advocates, big friends, such friends, my eyes drip Godward. A man might as well dispute with a god as dispute with another person. That's like talking to the walls. For only a few years are left to come, and I will walk a path that I cannot retrace. And he dies, right? So I think in our language, when he exposes the depths of his pain, and he says that the other can't understand him. Yes, on the one hand, he says that friendship falls when it can't witness the pain. But I think he's also saying something else which hasn't been said before. And what he's saying is, you're ultimately alone in your pain. Because you're going to die with that pain. It's going to end him. That's his fullness. And so he's saying another truth. You know your pain, and you're ultimately alone with your pain. There's just a limit. God is like banging your head against the wall to talk to God, like banging your head against the wall to talk to anybody else. One real truth of the sufferer is to realize, limit your expectations of friendship, of God. You're ultimately alone in this pain. That's a truth that he also learns from his body. Right? There is an inexpressibility to that pain. It just flows out, but you'll never understand it. Right? Doesn't mean, so there's a limit to friendship. And the wise person understands that. Right? There's a limit to trying to say that to God. it just doesn't fly up to heaven. It just dissolves on the way up. Because there's a lot of pain on the earth. And so at one level, there is this self-encapsulation of the self in pain. And that's also a truth. As true as the desire to express the pain, as true as the desire to dissolve into a God consciousness in humility, as true as the desire to lift it up into tradition, it's also true that you're alone in your pain. And that's not ego, that's just your pain. And so there's a deep wisdom here that's also true for Job. So I'm trying to give you these 4 texts, not to see them that they're arguing with each other, right versus wrong, right? But they all have a deep truth to them. And part of our reading of the book of Job and trying to understand it is to try to get inside these different expressions of wisdom. Right? Because it's just too easy to keep playing ping pong with the friends of Job. There are parts of those arguments, but there's also truth in these other statements. The question is, how do you keep the truth moving so that you keep learning and deepening each perspective? And I'm not saying that being alone in your pain is the end of it. It doesn't have to be the end of it. But at least in terms of the 4 examples, it's something else we hadn't seen before. All right. See you next week. Spy story. All right, I'll give it to you next week. All right, we'll carry it over till the spy story. I have to. I think.
You have to check with the government.
I have to check. Don't laugh. And it's not just this government. Tell you what. I just got to think about. I think enough time has gone by since.
Statute of limitations.
I think this limitations. I hope